Today on the border, federal officers in Laredo shut down that city's international bridge. They blamed the closure on the threat of a massive wave of undocumented immigrants trying to enter the U.S. without proper inspections. They diverted all cars to neighboring international bridges. One of the biggest flashpoints along the border last year, migrant families separated and detained. Both political parties denounced it, and tonight we've learned that some of those separations happened after the administration ordered the practice to stop. Our border reporter Oscar Margain explains the numbers.
In this border brief, family separations. There have been at least 245 migrant family separations since late June, when President Donald Trump announced the end of the practice known as zero tolerance. These numbers were disclosed by the Trump administration as part of a status report stemming from a lawsuit out of California by the American Civil Liberties Union. In 225 of these cases, the separation occurred because the parent was believed to have a criminal history, was being prosecuted at the time, or had a gang affiliation. 17 cases involved the parent having health issues or needing hospitalization. And in 3 cases, the Department of Homeland Security was unable to verify the relationship between the parent and the child. Apart from the 245, there are 4 other cases of family separations still under review. That's your border brief. I'm Oscar Margain reporting.